I can add another child, and maybe this is cheese. I'm not going to actually make that page, but just for demonstration purposes. Maybe I add another sale, another item for cookies. All right. So let's say those are the 3 items underneath products. Notice that I added them as child or children. So they're underneath products in the hierarchy. Then finally I'm going to end up by adding a contact us. And I'll put the URL in, which is contact us. Now when I run this, notice what I get menu-wise. All right. I get those 3 links, but this one that I have children underneath gives me sort of a pop-up menu. So I can easily go and then pick sales products and get to that page. Or I can go back to products or whatever. So that's a menu control. All right. You go in and you put things in, and you can enter things as children. And the good news is that you could have as many different children as you want to, and it will just keep adding menus on. So for example, if I went here, and maybe under cheese, there was a child for Swiss cheese. And I always do that. I always hit OK to close it. And maybe there's another one for American. All right. And again, what we'll do is we'll get the menus with the mouse over effects. So under products, if I pick cheese, whoops, I get that menu popping up. All right. Now, we can orient this menu a couple different ways. And we can also designate a few different properties of this. First of all, I could make this, let me see if I can find these attributes. Be oriented vertically or horizontally. If I make it be oriented horizontally, I'd have to change my style sheet for that. But it could extend the width of the page. So it could be oriented vertically like that. And now when I run it, I get the menu items like this instead of the way that they used to be. I can also choose things like how long they disappear disappear after. So in other words, I could make the menus disappear immediately. I think they give me 500 milliseconds, which is like half of a second. So I could really make it disappear after a long time. Let's go in and put 10,000 milliseconds. So if I put my mouse over that and move it, it'll stay there for 10 seconds before it disappears. Or 10 years, or whatever 10,000 milliseconds is. That'd be 10 seconds. All right. So you can make it disappear quickly, or you can make it disappear after a while. Again, remember, when you're doing code like this, you're using built-in stuff in the framework. So be very hesitant to reinvent the wheel. All right. You could write code to do this. But why bother when you have a nice configurable control that you can go in and use to use to implement that functionality. It's been tested. It will do things in a consistent manner. All right. Now, I'm going to go and I'm going to put a second navigation on this page. Normally, you won't have two navigations on the page. You may have a navigation and a sub-navigation, but normally you won't have two main navigations. But I'm going to do that just to demonstrate using the other kind of control. And that is a tree view. All right? Simply put, a tree view is like the kind of view that you get in certain options of Windows Explorer, or at least you used to. Yeah, not really. Never mind. So I'm going to go in, I'm going to create a second nav section on this page. And I'm going to do the rarest of rare things for myself. I'm actually going to comment my HTML code. Okay, so in this navigation section, I'm going to put a tree view. All right, let's go and edit that. And I can edit nodes, and I'm just going to create a few nodes. I'm not going to necessarily do all of them, but I do want to create a couple of levels. So I'll go and click Add one, and this will be the home page. And then I'll click a next one and do locations. Then I'll do products. And I'll add a child underneath that for sale products. wanted to click that and click child. If you get things on the wrong level, you can use these guys to move it over to the right or to the left. So I want this to be cheese. And I would have my then underneath that I could have create a child, Swiss. I always do that. And I can put American. So this is most of what I had on the other one, but I don't think quite all of them. But I think it's enough to see what I'm going to do here. Now, how are those two things different? Tree view, I don't think I can orient it horizontally. So it has to be oriented vertically. I don't believe I could do it that way. When I run this, what do I get? I get sections of my navigation that I can collapse or expand. So I can collapse it by pressing the minus sign, and I can expand them by pressing the plus. Now what's the difference? Here it does about the same thing, but as I move my mouse out, it disappears. Remember, I have a really long timeout for that, 10 seconds, so it will disappear eventually. All right. Whereas here, it will go, and it will be I can collapse them or hide them. Now, what if I want to only show initially a certain number of them? I can do that by, again, setting properties. The question of how do I do something, how do I configure it to make it behave differently than the default is almost always a question of what property do I want to change. So in this case, what property do I want to change? There is a property for how many levels I want to show. I think that's it. And I can say I only want to show one level, or I want to show 0 levels. And again, remember, us in programming, 0's actually kind of 1, shows the top level. All right. I can still expand it, but when I first go to the page, it will show only the top level. I go to another page, only shows the top level. And I can expand and hide, and it will show the stuff underneath it. Really, difference between the two are that the menus can be oriented horizontally or vertically. The tree is, to my knowledge, only vertically. It kind of doesn't make sense when you think about it horizontally. I suppose you could probably come up with something, but tree is typically oriented vertically. The menu, the sublevels are shown and hid based on putting your mouse over them. With the tree view, the menus are shown, the submenus are shown and hidden based on clicking a node. If you click a node and it has children, if you click the little plus sign next to it, it will expand it. If you click the little minus sign, then it will contract it again. All right, questions about that? All right. Last thing we're to do, and we won't do it all today, but we'll start on it, all right, is we're going to do our first case of what's called data binding. Now, what is data binding? Data binding is where you sort of marry two things together. Data binding is where you have data that comes from one place and a visual representation of the data in a different control. So far, whenever we've had controls that have data, like drop-downs, or radio buttons, or the menu control, or the tree view, we've gone and we've typed in the data manually. So for example, I wanted to edit this tree control, I went to edit nodes. And I manually go and type in all the different nodes. So the data is part of that control. This is not data binding. This is building the control with the data that you need in it. Data binding is where, for example, maybe our list of options don't come from some hard-coded list, but maybe they come from a database. All right? If you think of a drop-down for a particular value might actually be getting the data for the drop-down from a database. So if you wanted to search for classes by department, for example, on a college's website, you would expect whatever departments were in that college would appear in the drop-down. And if they go and add a new department to the college database, you would expect that department to now be in the drop-down. So in that case, we have two things. We have the visual representation of the data, and then we have the data source, where the data comes from. In a very short period of time, that is next week, all right, our data sources, or possibly Thursday, I guess it depends how it goes, but our data sources are going to be databases. So we're going to put things in databases, and we're going to then visually represent them on our web pages. All right? Until then, though, in our first example, we are going to be pulling data from an XML file. All right? We're going to be pulling our data for an XML file, or from an XML file, and we're going to populate two different things. All right? Again, the idea of pulling out something so that it only lives in one place is something that's always a winning concept in any kind of programming. So, here's the two things that we're going to be doing. And we're going to use an XML file for it. We are going to put on our page breadcrumbs. I think in the correct ASP.NET terminology, they call them a Sitemap Path. What is a Sitemap Path? It shows the user how they got to the place that they've got to on the website. So, for example, if you were on the Swiss cheese page in our example, it would show home, products, cheese, Swiss. Because that's the path that the user took to get to it. If you remember what our menu was like, our menu had home. I'm going to change it a little bit to have products indented underneath home. Actually, we had a few other things here too. We had home, location, products, sale products, cheese, Swiss, American, then we had contact us, or something like that. So let's say this is our navigation. On the top of the page shows the path that the user took to get there. So in other words, off the home page there's a product page. Off the product page there's a cheese page. Off the cheese page there is a Swiss page. So that's the path that the user took to get there. If they were on the location page, it would simply show home, location. Breadcrumbs or sitemap paths are valuable because it sort of shows the user how they got there. So if the user doesn't find what they're looking for, they can sort of easily retrace their steps. Now you can use the back button to be sure, but if you've clicked and gone down a bunch of menus, sometimes it's useful to use the breadcrumbs to get back to where you were looking or what you were looking for. Now, if you think about it for a second, this and this better be consistent. Could you imagine if your navigation said one thing and your sitemap path said something else? That'd be really confusing for the user. In addition to that, remember, our goal as programmers is to put stuff only in one place. All right? And therefore, if this and this really come from the same data, we shouldn't have to duplicate any effort. We shouldn't have to do something to show the sitemap path and something else to do the navigation. So, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to find a place to put the information about how our site is structured. And that place to put it is going to be our Sitemap Xml file. So, we're going to create a Sitemap Xml file. And then we're going to bind both of these controls to the same Sitemap Xml file. So, what do we have? If I add another page to my site, I add it to my Sitemap XML file, instantly this is adjusted to reflect this, and this is adjusted to reflect this. All right? So much of what we do in this class, if you think about it, so much of what we do in programming is taking something and finding just one place to put it, so we don't have to worry about changing it twice. All right? Or if we change the way that things are indented, maybe we put sales products on the same level as products or whatever. Or we add an extra category, European cheese and North American cheese or something like that. Any change that we make to the sitemap file will get reflected here and it will get reflected here. All right, so we'll keep that consistent. Now, we probably have all heard the term XML file before. Have we all heard the term XML file? Okay. What is an XML file?
I've always seen it as kind of like an efficient data storage file.
Okay.
Like a database or a spreadsheet or just several columns of data that relate.
Okay. It's a way, first of all, of storing data. All right. And data could be stored a bunch of different ways. In the old days, data was stored in what were called flat files. A flat file is just where you just simply have rows of data. It would be like a spreadsheet. What's distinct about an XML file is that you can store the data and you can store the structure of the data. You can store the hierarchy of the data. Let's say, for example, we were doing an XML file for a library. All right? we were representing some kind of data about books in a library. So we have Edgar Allan Poe, and he wrote The Raven and Telltale Heart. And we have William Shakespeare. He wrote Hamlet and Romeo and Juliet. And Julius Caesar. And a bunch of other stuff. All right. There's a hierarchy in this data, right? All these things aren't conceptually on the same level. If we were making an outline of authors and their works, these things belong to Edgar Allan Poe. These things belong to Shakespeare. All right? So that's a hierarchy. It matters the way that they're indented. All right? You can do that in XML. You can't easily do that in the old days flat files. In the old days of flat files, you had to write special code to get that sort of hierarchy. But with XML, you can easily show that these pieces of data belong with this. These pieces of data belong to this. XML stands for Extensible Markup Language. What else have we seen that is a markup language? HTML. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. HTML is a special purpose markup language. It's a language that we use to define web pages. XML is a format that we can use to define any data, provided, and we can exchange data between parties, parties being different applications and so on, provided that both parties know the rules of the particular XML data. All right? Now, in the case of, and how do we show in HTML, for example, that a certain piece of code is in the navigation section? So we had a set of links that were in the navigation section a few minutes ago. How did we show that these links were part of the navigation section? A beginning and end. We nested those tags. So we can do the exact same thing with XML. We can nest tags. So, XML is also a markup language. By markup language, it means we use tags. The X stands for extensible, which means that we can use it for any kind of purpose, not just for HTML. Not just for defining web pages, but defining any kind of data, provided everyone knows the rules of how that data is stored. So, I could make an XML file that would look like this, that would represent this data.